thank you all so much for joining us for Norman Rockwell on Art. America's favorite illustrator is best known for his relatable scenes of modern American life with subjects selected for their broad appeal, things like families, holiday celebrations, and young love. Rockwell was also fond of making paintings about painting and the art world in general, topics one wouldn't necessarily associate with commercial art for the middle class. But this program considers the various ways Rockwell explored art making and museums over the course of his career with a healthy dose of the artist's good humor. And it's led by art historian Jane Oneail, who's the owner of Culturally Curious. Jane curates and delivers art appreciation programs to audiences throughout New England. She holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University. Born and raised in New Hampshire, Jane has worked at some of her state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, as well as the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane has also taught at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New England University. So I again want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Public Library and the Corning Foundation for co-sponsoring this morning's program, and all 160 plus of us who are watching live and the many more that will watch the recording. Let's give Jane a big virtual round of applause for joining us this morning. And Jane, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Robert. And thank you everybody for taking time out of your day to spend it with me and with Norman Rockwell. I just feel like he's the perfect subject for this month, especially on the heels of the 4th of July. He's like as American as apple pie, isn't he? So we will have a great time this morning. I think getting a really broad overview of his works that touch on this subject of art and artists and art historical references. You know, Mark Twain once famously wrote, "Write what you know." And when it comes to Norman Rockwell, I think he really followed that advice. He painted what he knew, and he knew the art world. He knew his art history, and he knew a lot about making art. So we'll see all the ways he kind of fuses that with these typical subjects of the American middle class in the 20th century. So before we dive in, I just wanted to give a quick introduction or reintroduction for everyone to the artist here. And this is a self-portrait that we're looking at right now. We'll touch on it a little bit later, but I thought it was an interesting self-portrait where he's painting himself painting one of his paintings. Okay, so getting reacquainted with Norman Rockwell, we can see him here in a sketch for his famous triple self-portrait that he did in 1959. So Norman Rockwell was born in 1894. He died in 1978, and he was a commercial illustrator that created hundreds of oil paintings for cards, for calendars, and for magazines, most notably the Saturday Evening Post, where he created over 320 different covers in more than 47 years. So a pretty impressive resume. He's known as the painter of American life, the painter of American stories, the chronicler of the middle class. And it's grounded in this idea that he was an artist who could really find and kind of tease out relatable content. He painted the experiences that we all shared. And so to really give a good example of that, I think we can see on the right his painting called The Freedom from Want as part of his For Freedom series from 1943. And of course, it's this archetypal image of a family gathering, a family meal, possibly a holiday meal. And we've all had a family gathering that looks like this in some way, right? So it's just a great example of how this artist knew the subjects that would make all Americans feel like they're a part of this American experience. Now, to expand on that just a little bit, we have this notion that that Rockwell was also creating art about his world, the art world. And he was making these images relatable to the average American. I don't think most of us think of Rockwell as an artist who created art about art, but we'll see today how he sort of sneaks it in, he spoon feeds it, and he makes these art historical references throughout his career. So on the right now, we have an image called The Antique Hunter from 1937. I think it's such a charming image of this very self-satisfied woman who is strolling with just armfuls of these treasures that she just recently acquired, probably at great prices here. Now, there isn't a specific art historical reference here, but we can see that she's carrying a sculptural bust. We can see that she's carrying a framed portrait. And there's even this portfolio, this red portfolio here with more two-dimensional images. So even if you're not an antique hunter or an antique collector or art collector, you still get tickled by all the detail here, and especially this real look of satisfaction on the antique hunter's face. So there's always something for us to relate to here. So let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend this next hour together. I've broken this up into a few sections. We're going to start off with Rockwell's depictions of everyday artists, and then turn to how he specifically chose the act of painting other painters. Then we'll just touch on some of his images about museums and fine art. And then he begins to quote other paintings and works of art within his works. Those are always like a fun little I spy. And then we'll finish up with some of his art historical references. Now, if you've ever been out to the Rockwell Museum and Studio in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, maybe you had the chance to tour his studio, and I have this photograph here of his brushes, which are, I think, unbelievably clean. Apparently he was a very meticulous man. So we'll start off with this very notion of art making to get us going. So let's take a look at some everyday artists. And I have this very broad idea here, but we're going to narrow it down pretty quickly. So we're going to just get started with this idea of making marks. As an artist, Norman Rockwell, when he painted other artists, he got to sort of create mark making through their bodies, through their ideas. And I think he delighted in this idea of being able to pick up a tube of lipstick and make some marks. So in the 1922 painting on the left, we see this little girl who might need a little bit more practice in terms of her application of her makeup, but she still seems incredibly satisfied with the results. It's such a charming image. And then on the right, we have a 1940 image called The Hitchhiker, and it portrays, what could be interpreted as like a lazy young man who has painted his desired location on this leather suitcase here. We can see his threadbare socks and his kind of laissez-faire attitude as he's just leaning back, hoping that somebody might pick him up before all the autumn leaves fall around him. Now, notice too that he's plucking at this ukulele, and the sides of the ukulele have also been painted here to sort of subtly suggest that this man longs for the life of an artist. And I think Rockwell probably faced this preconceived notion too, that the life of an artist might be a little bit easier than the life of somebody working 9 to 5. Now, this next image here of an everyday artist, this is a little boy in a painting called Painting the Little House from 1921. And this young man is engaged in this kind of frustrating process of painting this very large birdhouse. You can see that there are like little sticks out here so that the birds can perch there. Now, notice how this Rockwell has captured the difference between the red paint that's already been applied and dried and this new wet paint that's being applied and sort of dripping down the chimney here. I love this look of concentration on the little boy's face. Notice that there's red paint smudged on his forehead, his nose, his arms here, and it's getting all over the floor. So that red paint on the floor kind of draws our attention to the fact that there are other cans of paint in this space. This is a little boy who is engaged in art making, in the creative process. Now, this little puppy here who could easily steal the show kind of draws our attention to this back wall here, where we see the tail of a kite and a kite up above in the top left corner. Now, if you have really good eyes, you might notice that there is a face painted on that kite, and then another face painted on this wall here. So we get the sense that this little guy here really likes to create. Maybe it's even a version of Norman Rockwell when he was little. Now, we've got this great photo of Rockwell actually creating this image. We've got his models right alongside, complete with the little puppy here. I think it's always fun to see Norman Rockwell as a younger man too. We see so many photos of him as an older man, but I thought you'd get a kick out of the fact that he once said, if a painting isn't going well, just add a puppy and an injured foot. So that's exactly what we see happening in this picture. Now, his next image of an everyday artist is a painting called She's My Baby from 1927. And the title for this work was inspired by a popular movie that was out at the time. And here we're witness to this very sweet scene between these two kids. Rockwell loved to paint scenes of like young puppy love. And in this image, we see the boy is busy painting this loving text and these two overlapping hearts on the back of this girl's very large green raincoat here. So once again, we see how Rockwell captures the look and feel of this wet red paint on the end of this paintbrush as this boy carefully applies the color. Now, at his feet over here are other jars of paint that he is using. Now, if we zoom out just for a second, see the painting within its frame, I just wanted to give a little bit more context to this work. This was a painting that Rockwell did as his first marriage was sort of coming to an end. And so art historians really like to tie this into what was happening in his biography. Notice that this little artist that he's painted is wearing men's shoes that are way too big for him, and even seems to have the hand of a man here. He's got a pinky ring and a wristwatch. So you could easily make the case that the little artist depicted here is a kind of self-portrait of Norman Rockwell. Now, some of Rockwell's everyday artists aren't necessarily slathering on the red paint. In fact, he did this whole series of paint varnish advertisements in the 1920s. And they are surprisingly and amazingly sentimental depictions of everyday artists. So over here on the left, we see a little girl and a man in sort of work clothes. We can see that his work varnishing this floor here has been interrupted so that he can varnish the little girl's doll bed. And that paintbrush that's loaded with varnish, but to the average American's eyes, it's just a paintbrush. It sort of connects him to the girl and the process here. And there's just this delight and satisfaction in creating that. Now, over here on the right, another one of these varnish ads, we have a well-dressed elderly man. He's kneeling in what looks like an attic type space, and he's brushing this varnish on a cradle, presumably for a new grandchild. And I love just how intently he's doing this work. So in each of these images, the varnish could easily be read as paint. And the fact that they're both applied with brushes immediately makes this link to us in our brains to the art world. And I think that's even more so reinforced by the last varnish commercial I'm going to show you, but this is one from 1924. Rockwell is again playing off of these associations with brushing on varnish and brushing on paint. So we're looking at this dingy storeroom here, and it's filled with buckets and brushes and red paint. And we see an older man who is imparting a lesson about this tin of floor varnish in his hands. And the young man across from him, who's sitting on a smaller box here, is listening very intently. The picture is called Master and Apprentice, borrowing from the language of the art world here and creating more associations in the mind of the viewers here. So sometimes our everyday artists are not working with traditional canvases. This is called Inspilled Paint, the road line painter's problem from 1937. And so here we see another working class stand-in for an artist. We have a figure who's wearing these white coveralls here, and it almost looks like he's got a police uniform on underneath them. And he is standing here with this bucket of white paint and this huge white paintbrush to touch up the lines on the road. And of course, what's happening, we've got a dog and a cat chasing each other wildly, completely oblivious to the fact that they are ruining this painter's work. So Rockwell has created this very relatable scene, the chaos caused by pets, right? And placed it on a quiet street and inserted a painter, sort of unifying modern life and the act of painting here. Certainly it's a frustration that feels very relatable, doesn't it? Okay, this next image of an everyday artist is from the circus, and Rockwell finds artists everywhere, doesn't he? This is Carousel Horses from 1947. Rockwell invites us to peek past this horse here in the foreground to see an artist who's taken one of these carousel horses off of the carousel and is applying this kind of vivid yellow paint to it. We've got three little boys who are standing behind him. You get the sense that they're probably asking him a ton of questions as he's doing this work. And then just beyond them, there's more painted motifs here, more parts of the circus, included this kind of Amazonian lady who seems like she is fighting these carnivorous plants here. But the boys are mostly interested, for the most part, interested in the act of painting more so than the bare-breasted Amazon. It's the creative act that's keeping them engaged. And I'm sure Rockwell himself has had many of an opportunity where people wanted to stand over his shoulder like that. We'll see it's a continuing theme. In the tattoo artist, we've got a wartime picture here for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. Now we are the ones who are looking over at the artist's shoulder. We see him from the back, and he's engaged in working on his living canvas here, this sunburned young sailor. And of course, the joke is that he's crossing off all these women's names and adding yet another one. I think Norman Rockwell probably would have gotten a real kick out of the fact that he also got to paint this kind of catalog of images, typical tattoos that sailors of the day might have chosen. This is a work from 1944. We have a similar image here from the 1930s, from 1935. It's called The Sign Painter. And the composition is similar in that we're looking at the artist from behind. Notice too that this artist is this very young, very scrawny figure here. He's wearing a beret, but he's not quite wearing it right, is he? He's got all the tools of the trade. He's sitting here on this bowed piece of board, and he's got his paintbrushes, his maul stick, his reference image, and he is painting the details of a billboard. We've already got the rough outlines here, and it looks like it's this elegant woman. He's filling in her eyebrows, and we've got one detailed eyeball here. Underneath the young man is the word kiss, and that's, you know, a fun little joke here because that's essentially what he's doing. He's right up close to this elegant woman. So I think with a work like this, it's so close to what Rockwell was doing, but it's the sort of sight that people might have seen out and about living their daily lives, that it could really unify the art world and you know, the world of the average American. Now, can you really talk about making art without including the big guy himself, Santa? So here he is with his elves from 1922. And wouldn't it make sense that Rockwell himself could really relate to being a sleepy old guy working on a deadline? So notice here we've got Santa who is dozed off. He's got another or a project on his lap that's a rush order, and his little elves are all springing into action. They're applying the red paint. They're hoisting up this little can of red paint and making sure that everything gets finished on time for the big night. So it seems like a nice little callback to the little boy struggling to paint that birdhouse that we saw before. So we see Rockwell, while he paints these everyday artists, he's really kind of playing out his frustrations, his challenges as a professional artist, but he's doing it in terms that the average American could relate to. So now let's turn our attention to Rockwell's interest in painting painters, namely other professional artists or artists working with kind of professional materials. So we see here, early on in Rockwell's career, he amassed this collection of colonial and antique costumes and props. He really imagined himself as somebody who would be painting more of American history than more of contemporary life. Eventually in the 1940s, his studio burns down and he loses those props and costumes. So he really changes his focus. But in Pipe and Bowl Sign Painter from 1926, we see an early American artist, presumably an itinerant artist who never had like formal training in the arts. Notice that he's using a chair as an easel here, and he's painting not necessarily a work of fine art, but a utilitarian sign. And there is a simplicity to the way that the sign has been painted. Notice the lines to suggest the shadow here. Rockwell normally paints himself as an artist with a pipe sticking out of his mouth. In this case, it's this revolutionary era figure here who has the pipe and the little wine glass in his hand to signify exactly what this sign is all about. So this was the first Saturday Evening Post cover to use this new 4-color printing process, which would allow for more accurate representation of the artist's color. So it just makes sense that Norman Rockwell would choose to paint another artist for that special opportunity. Now, he did do one other colonial sign painter. I'm sorry, this is the best resolution I could get this image here. And we can see that about a decade later, when he returns to the subject, he just sort of fleshes it out. He adds more context to it. Our sign painter is now working on a city street. He's kind of churning out these signs that refer to George Washington now. And now he's got some onlookers, people who are curious about the creative act. And so if this is already reminding you of the little kids hunching over the circus painter over here, you're right on the money. And notice some of these figures are even standing with the exact same poses. So it's always fun to sort of see how Norman Rockwell, over his very long career, recycles certain ideas. Okay. So this next image here was painted for the cover of the Literary Digest in 1922, and it's called The Artist's Daughter, which is kind of funny because at the time that Norman Rockwell painted this, he had no children, and even later on when he did have children, he never had a daughter. So the painting has little to do with the artist's life. The motif of painting a pretty young girl and calling her the artist's daughter is something that existed before Norman Rockwell. So other than the little girl that we saw with the messy makeup and the very confident expression, this is our first glimpse of a female artist as depicted by Norman Rockwell. And she's engaged in this very serious act of looking very carefully at her doll and then trying to construct her doll's portrait. And of course, this is a little bit unwieldy because she's working with adult-sized tools and materials here, but her focus and her determination, I would say, seem very worthy of our respect. She's a sweet little girl, isn't she? Well, over the next few years, Norman Rockwell paints a number of young girls who are creating art using more like professional materials. So this is a painting called Hayseed Critic from 1921. We can see a young girl in her smock and her beret. She's got her artist box here, and she's studiously working on a painting en plein air, as the French say, or really as Americans would say, outside. We can see the grass under her feet. And because she's outside, there's the occasion of somebody who might not normally be interested in art making, who strolls over and is very curious about what she's doing. Notice how he's leaning over her from behind. This is a recurring theme in Rockwell's work, but it's an interesting dynamic here. She is all kind of soft contours, and he is like these straight lines. Even his jawline here is so angular. Now, she's got the brush. He's got the little piece of straw hanging out of his mouth. So she's working, and presumably because he's called the Hayseed Critic, he's the one doing the talking. Norman Rockwell's basically implying that maybe he's not quite qualified to do that. So it's really a study of opposites, and that's what happens so often with these Rockwell images. She's young, he's older, she's female, he's male, and she's elegant, he's simple. But it's interesting to me, there's always something to kind of unify these figures. She's got this lovely red scarf around her neck, and that's sort of complemented by the handkerchief coming out of his pocket here. So we have a similar young girl painted just a few years later in, I think, what's a favorite Rockwell for many people. This is called Wet Paint from 1930. And we see a young girl who's also got an artist smock on. She had a beret, but it's flown off her head because she is dashing to some sort of cover here, because as she was painting this lovely landscape that she's holding, the rain has come in suddenly, and she has got to make sure that her painting stays dry or else it will get ruined. So it's a little play, a little pun on wet paint. The paint might still be wet, but we don't want the canvas to get wet from the rain. So Rockwell has described all of her paint tools and equipment in great detail. They actually belonged to him. And I love the seriousness of her expression, her determination to get home, and this wonderful sense of movement in this picture, and that contrast between the bright blue sky in her painting and the clouds in the background over here. Now, another painting of a painter comes to us by way of this very complicated image that Norman Rockwell created in 1949. It's called The Roadblock. And in this scene, with more than 20 figures in it, we have Norman Rockwell including an artist as just an everyday member of the community. And of course, he would think to include an artist because he thought of himself as an everyday member of the community. Now, the setup here, the joke is that there's this big box truck in this narrow alley. They can't get anywhere because there's this bulldog out in front of him, out in front of the truck. They're trying to move the bulldog or lure him away, and it's drawn out all of these people who are kind of gawking at the spectacle here. Norman Rockwell created this complicated image with all of these perspectival lines leading our eye back to this bulldog at the bottom center. And I would say the figure that is pointing most emphatically is that artist. So let's zoom in on him just for a second. This is the model for this picture was actually an artist, a friend of Rockwell's who taught at the LA County Art Institute. We can see that his mouth is agape, his long arms are even extended by that brush here, and we can see his palette and other brushes in his other hand. In that open window, we can see other images, sketches that he's made and tacked up. And then there's this wonderful joke here too, that he is accompanied by this lovely young woman who was probably nude up until just a few seconds ago. She's just draped herself in this pink blanket. She's got a cigarette in her hand, and she's also gazing at the spectacle of this bulldog. I think that this is such a wonderful little slice of life in this particular picture, because it invites us as viewers to contemplate what was happening just before this dog created this big scene too. Incidentally, Rockwell included his own violin here, peeking out the window over here, and his son is posed as a violin student who couldn't possibly get up for his lesson over there. Now, Rockwell painted himself painting many times over the course of his career. We're not going to be able to cover all of them, but I wanted to give you sort of a sense in terms of what they looked like and how they kind of fit into his body of work and his persona as a public figure. So from left to right, we have the gangly young man over here who has a creative block in 1938's blank canvas, to this sense of a serious and methodical practitioner of painting in his noted work, 1953 Soda Jerk. Now, if we keep moving to the right here, we see a seasoned expert at this point in a picture where he's surrounded by the Boy Scouts. He had a long relationship with the Boy Scouts. And this is a picture called Beyond the Easel from 1966. And then we can see finally in one of his last self-portraits, he's a celebrated icon at this point. And this is an image called Let Freedom Ring that was painted for the cover of American Artist magazine in 1976. So in all of these works, he's showing himself in a various stage of the creative process. But of course, what we don't see here is his famous triple self-portrait. I dropped that into a different section. We will get to it. But for now, we're going to consider Rockwell museums and fine art. So beyond painting artists at work, Rockwell had a specific interest in the world of fine art and museums. Now, unlike other prestigious illustrators like N.C. Wyeth, for example, who longed to be taken seriously as a fine art artist, Norman Rockwell never had a problem with being an illustrator, even though his oil paintings have been celebrated for their detail and complexity. So it's this kind of complicated relationship that he had with being a commercial artist versus the world of fine art. So let's see how that plays out. This is an early painting from the Great Depression. This is called Delivering Two Busts, or Man Holding Two Portrait Busts. It's from 1931. So in the midst of the Great Depression, we see this kind of sad sack figure over here who looks pretty dejected. At least he's got a job, right? But he doesn't seem particularly pleased with his job. And the joke here is kind of like he's got these two beautiful idealized sculptural busts. This is actually a famous bust of Apollo, and this would be the head of the Venus de Milo here. And it's almost as though this man is like at a cocktail party where he doesn't quite fit in, right? Of course, they're going to relate to each other, and he's just kind of somebody who can't quite get into the conversation. Now, this is another study of opposites. They are idealized. And he is a little bit cartoonish. He's got these big ears and this furrowed brow here. So in many ways, he almost looks like the sad sack who could never get the girl. But Norman Rockwell is setting that all up within the context of this reference to famous works of art here. Now, in this next image, Rockwell brings us right into a museum, sort of getting a behind the scenes look at one too, because we can see a museum worker who is moving a frame around. The work is called Framed from 1946. And the people in museums who do this kind of work, the heavy lifting, are more like working class individuals for the most part. So we're not looking at a curator, somebody who is knowledgeable of all the art. We're just looking at somebody who's doing the heavy lifting here. And Norman Rockwell portrays him in mid-stride. He's busy doing this work, and he's holding the frame in such a way that it frames him as though he's, another one of the pictures on the wall. There's this great kind of visual play there. Rockwell goes even further. He uses this age-old trope of the paintings kind of coming alive and responding to what's happening in this room. So we've got this Renoir-like nude here who's glancing over her shoulder, kind of smiling at this moment, a Revolutionary era soldier who looks down in disdain, and then just behind this museum worker, this kind of scowling face there. I always get the sense that he just doesn't want his view to be blocked here. When it comes to his museum paintings, I think this is probably his best known. It's called the Art Critic from 1955. And once again, we have Rockwell giving a nod to that tradition of paintings coming alive. We have a painter, some people interpret him as like an art student who is very carefully studying the brushwork on this Rubens-esque painting over here. He's even using a little magnifying glass to do so. And because the paintings are coming alive, she looks very inquisitive and a little coquettish, like returning this gaze here, because he is so closely examining this necklace in her bosom. And the bearded men over here on the right seem a little disturbed, maybe a little bit alarmed by this kind of intimate interaction that's taking place in the galleries. You'll also notice that he's got the museum guide in his hand behind his back, and it references the same picture on the wall, and she's not making that comical expression there. So Rockwell once said that he envied his students who swooned when they went to the Louvre and viewed the Mona Lisa, because he never felt that kind of passion. But here he's taken the museum experience and he's made it kind of silly, kind of magical, more relatable probably to the average American than, say, gazing at, what is oftentimes considered to be the underwhelming Mona Lisa when you see her in person. Now, this next image here has ties close to home, especially if you're from the Massachusetts area. This is a work that's called Lunch Break with a Knight, or The Night Watchman. I just love the pun. This is from 1962. And the museum that we're viewing here is the Higgins Armory Museum, which before it closed was the second largest collection of armor in North America. So Rockwell had gone there, he took a bunch of pictures, he looked at the collections, he talked to the staff, and then he went home and developed a very large format sketch sketch that we see over here on the left, and then the finished work for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. And so we have this hall that's filled with the armor of these, brave soldiers from bygone eras. And if you'd ever been to the Higgins, they had these incredible displays that looked like, horses with knights on the back, like we see here. So this would have been a fake horse, of course. But in this kind of silly frame up, the horse has this kind of bulging eye, and he seems to be looking down at the night watchman, who has sort of thoughtlessly or unconsciously become a part of this display. He's taking his little break here on the pedestal, pouring himself some coffee. You'll notice in the picture, he's set aside his apple and he's going to have some cake. Who among us hasn't done that? In the sketch, I love too that his feet are kind of hanging off the floor. You get the sense that he's a little shrimp in this room full of these gallant knights. But I get the sense that that the horse, maybe he wants the cake, but I think he's also a little bit upset that this night watchman has thrown his jacket over the foot of this knight here, and we can see his flashlight and the clock piece, the timepiece that he would have used to keep time while he was doing his job. So this motif of things coming to life, animating the art world is something Rockwell goes back to again and again. Even sort of related, a zookeeper who is eating his meat sandwich here, and the lion that seems so interested in it. Of course, the lion was already alive. Okay. So we're going to move on now, and we're going to take a look at pictures within pictures. And I always get the sense that for an artist to do this, it's kind of like flexing a muscle. It's kind of showing off because it's their opportunity to say, not only can I paint like the way I paint, but I can also recreate one of these other artists' work. And we see this throughout his career, but I wanted to start off with this really fun April Fool's Saturday Evening Post cover from 1948. Now, his April Fool's covers, I believe he did 3 of them total. They're this illogical mix of objects from, in this case, the man-made world, the natural world, and here it's set in an antique shop. So we have all sorts of distractions in this image, but I wanted to point out a few kind of call outs to the art world. I wanted to start over here with this plaster sculpture. This would be a reference to the work of an artist named John Rogers, who created these kind of tabletop plaster sculptures that were really popular at the end of the 19th century. He was an American artist, and he was a great storyteller. He was like Rockwell before Rockwell. So it would sort of make sense that Rockwell was interested in his work. In this case, the illogical combination here is that he's taken one figure from one of John Rogers groups, and then a figure from a different one, and sort of collapsed them together, a soldier and a young woman who's about to get married. She's going to see the parson here. But of course, the art historical reference that I think everybody would get right off the bat when they look at the April Fool's cover is this famous face over here. Of course, he's painted the Mona Lisa. Rockwell has painted the Mona Lisa. Now, if that's not showing off a little bit, I don't know what is. He has reversed the image, of course, and he's given her a little bit of a halo here, you might notice. And he's also reversed his own signature, which I think is like an interesting way that kind of ties him to the Mona Lisa. He's also misspelled his own name here, if you're keeping track of all of the absurdities in this picture. Now, the next image I wanted to show you, where he's quoting another work of art, it's nowhere near as prestigious as the Mona Lisa. It's a picture called New Calendar from 1956. And we see Rockwell's comedic storytelling at play. We have an older man who's just hung up a calendar with the image of kind of a sexy cowgirl as his skeptical wife looks on. Once again, Norman Rockwell did not paint a lot of nudes or even a lot of conventionally attractive women. So this was a little chance of his to paint somebody who was downright sexy. But he was doing this by way of quoting one of his fellow artists, a friend of his, an illustrator named Gil Elvgren. The two artists had met a couple of years earlier. Rockwell had sort of expressed to him a little bit of jealousy that Elvgren's models were much more attractive than his, but in truth, Rockwell probably liked it that way. He never really seemed too comfortable painting beautiful women. So in this painting, he gets the chance to sort of emulate his friend, show that he could paint a pinup if he needed to, but really set up the comedy as well, do the good storytelling. But now you can tell people, you know, Rockwell painted a pinup. Most people don't think of him that way. And as we're thinking about quoting other pictures, that brings us to the famous triple self-portrait, which is rife with visual quotations here. We have artists have been painting their reflected images for centuries, but it's Rockwell, of course, who adds his typical humor to this motif. Now, this setup here, looking at an artist from behind, we're the people who are standing over his shoulder, looking at him at work. We've already seen several works where he's doing this, so this is a familiar composition. Now, if we get to the quotation part of it, we call this the triple self-portrait, but you'll notice up here he's tacked up a couple of sketches, multiple sketches. I can see clearly at least 4 others. So this is like the 7-way self-portrait in many cases. And of course, the joke here is that Rockwell is looking into a mirror. He sees this scrawny sort of pencil neck geek with glasses on and this kind of drooping pipe. And then he paints a very debonair version of himself without the glasses and with this kind of jaunty pipe sticking out of his mouth. But the other joke is that Norman Rockwell has added all of these great self-portraits from major artists throughout history. We have Albert Dürer, Rembrandt, Picasso, and Van Gogh being referenced there. So he's thinking about how great artists of the past have handled this specific challenge. But I think it's also a joke because, you know, his self-portrait really has nothing to do with the images that he has tacked up on his canvas. So there's a lot more to say about the triple self-portrait, but we're going to continue on with an image that is related in many ways. And it was done just about a year after his triple self-portrait. This is called Artist at Work. Once again, we're seeing a creative individual from behind, but this certainly isn't Norman Rockwell. This is a young man. He's a professional man. He's got this kind of tidy workspace, and we can see that he works for the Saturday Evening Post, and he's kind of reimagining what the masthead would look like. So we've got the Saturday Evening Post going back to its origins. Here's the Pennsylvania Gazette, and all of these various cover illustrations sort of fanned out across this artist's desk. So in this case, Norman Rockwell is doing some visual quotations here. You'll notice this cover over here corresponds to the cover that we see on in the middle image here. And that is a cover by Norman Rockwell's mentor, sort of a hero, an artist named J.C. Leyendecker, who worked for the Saturday Evening Post and had a career that was very much like Rockwell's before Rockwell, really, but he came to specialize in these strange kind of baby pictures. And this is a New Year's picture with a baby hammering an anvil, as they do. He's creating the one for 1931 here. But the other image alongside that is this image here, which is actually a Norman Rockwell cover. So Rockwell's quoting himself in this picture. This is part of a wartime series that he did on an imagined soldier named Willie Gillis. And the joke here is what to do in a blackout. And we've got Willie Gillis with naughty things on his mind. So so fascinating to me that Norman Rockwell sets up these opportunities where he can quote his mentor and visually quote himself in one painting. Now, you might think that Picasso or Sargent versus Picasso here that was painted in 1966, maybe this belongs in the museum section that we saw before, but we have Rockwell in this case, specifically recreating 2 actual paintings that are in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago. And these 2 specific paintings, he doesn't modify, he doesn't make them come to life. Instead, he focuses really on the different audiences that are looking at these images. This is Sargent's work from 1897 called Mrs. George Swinton. And in the back, this is called Red Armchair by Picasso from 1931. We have a woman here who's a mother. She and her daughter and their doll both have curlers in their hair. they're just kind of fancy otherwise to go to the museum. And then we have a casual young woman wearing blue jeans with her hair undone, observing the Rockwell. So, or I'm sorry, observing the Picasso. So in the midst of these cultural revolutions that are happening in the 1960s, we have Rockwell kind of showing us two different versions of what femininity and women's liberation might look like. And that's encapsulated not just by the women in the museum, but by the works that they're looking at here. So to round out this section about visual quotations, I wanted to share with you one of my favorite works from late in his career. This is a painting called Waiting for the Art Editor. It's from 1970, which is why we get these kind of garish colors here. And it's another one of these paintings that's a study of opposites, young and old, inexperienced versus professional. So the focus here is really this young artist who's kind of a hippie. He's got this long red hair. He's got informal clothes. We can even see he's wearing sandals. And I just love the way Picasso has painted his little toes peeking out from underneath his overflowing artist portfolio here. And the way he sits with his back up straight and his chin held high, you just get the sense that he doesn't know what he doesn't know. He's filled with all of this confidence. And then we have a seasoned illustrator or artist sitting alongside of him in a pinstripe suit, looking like the most professional gentleman you could imagine. And he's a little bit hunched over in comparison, and he's glancing up at that red-headed kid with a little bit of skepticism, a little bit of curiosity, and maybe even a little bit of wondering, you know, is this what the field is about to become? Now, just behind them, sort of unifying these two figures, connecting them, is a painting by Michelangelo. So we have Norman Rockwell quoting Michelangelo, the Renaissance master, in the back of this picture here. And it's a saint that will, or a prophet, I should say, that we will be getting a little bit better for acquainted with in just a moment. But in this case, once again, without making the painting come alive, the prophet of Isaiah seems to be kind of looking down at this little redhead with that same sense of skepticism. But once again, I think it's a really remarkable thing for any artist to kind of take on, like, I'm going to paint a Da Vinci, I'm going to paint a Michelangelo, and just drop it into my painting. Otherwise, I think it's a really impressive feat. And so we see Rockwell doing that once again here. So we're going to switch gears, and our last major section here is about art historical references. And this is really when Rockwell isn't directly quoting a painting from art history, but really creating something in reference to it or inspired by it. But it's really fun to pull out those reference images and to get a sense in terms of what he was looking at and how his ideas were formulated. So this first image here is actually an ad from the 1920s. It's a GE ad. General Electric, and what we're looking at is a woman, presumably like a housewife, who has taken all of her oil lamps, brought them to the kitchen table, and she's letting the natural light kind of flood in here as she's dismantling the lamps and then filling them with oil. What an interesting way to sell electricity, right? Like, you won't have to do this if you get electricity in your house. So, so she doesn't look particularly downtrodden by this, but it looks like, you know, an activity that if you could get out of doing it, you would. And this is so similar to the kind of composition that Vermeer, the Dutch Baroque famed artist, was well known for creating. He loved an interior with light sort of filtering in from the left-hand side. And in this case, we have another woman at a table engaged in this kind of delicate work. She's holding this little scale here. But notice the direction of their faces and their gazes. Notice that it looks as though their eyes are closed in both of these scenes. I would imagine that Rockwell looked very closely at Vermeer's work before creating this advertisement. Now, the next ad I wanted to show you is from 1930s, and it's called The Fruit of the Vine. So it's essentially a raisin commercial. But the composition is very similar because I think, once again, he's looking to Vermeer. So here's Rockwell's ad. We've got like a grandmother type figure, and presumably her daughter, who has brought over all these raisins and is dumping them out on the table. The mother looks delighted by this. Notice how and the composition is so similar. It's at a table. There's the light filtering in from the window on the left. We see the same thing in Vermeer's famous painting, The Milkmaid, where she is not dumping raisins, but sort of gently pouring this milk into this vessel on the table. So this is an image with these beautiful blues over here, and the woman whose hair is kind of obscured by this headscarf. We see something similar over here with this younger woman wearing the blues. Most of her hair is kind of obscured by this hat here. So there's a lot to be said about those comparisons when it comes to Vermeer and Rockwell, especially at this early stage of his career. I think his best known art historical reference is the beloved work of Rosie the Riveter. Everybody loves her. She's from 1943. Powerful, she's confident, she's capable, and she's taking on a traditionally male role to support the war effort and to stomp out fascism. We see her resting her foot here on Adolf Hitler's autobiography, Mein Kampf. So many people know that the figure that inspired Rosie the Riveter and this pose was once again Michelangelo's prophet Isaiah from the Sistine Chapel ceiling, which explains why Rosie the Riveter has these enormous arms and this incredible sense of confidence here. It comes from this figure that was painted on the ceiling, roughly 70 feet above our heads. Michelangelo knew that in order to create a figure that was legible from that great distance, you had to make that figure monumental. So we have this kind of thoughtful prophet here who's referring back to this reading, and his pose, his other hand is in this gesture, this thoughtful gesture. Rockwell updates that to Rosie sitting there with her lunch bucket and holding a sandwich in her hand. Now, another layer to this is that the reason that Isaiah is so large in the Sistine Chapel is that he's an Old Testament prophet. So that means he really serves as a foundation for the other kinds of storytelling that take place just above his head, storytelling from the New Testament. So he's serving, he's kind of holding that up in some ways, right along with these little painted putti on either side of him. So he's serving as a foundation. And in some ways, Rosie the Riveter is serving as this new kind of foundation for the war effort. And to make her this massive figure like Norman Rockwell desired was to show just how capable and how important that role was. Now, you might be wondering how Norman Rockwell found a model with arms like this. Where did he go? Did he go to bodybuilding competitions? No. Well, just like Michelangelo, he invented muscles. So here he is with the actual model for Rosie the Riveter. You can see that she's a woman of slender proportions here. Rockwell actually called her and apologized for making her look so big, but of course the end result was an unforgettable figure. So along with his reference to Michelangelo here with Rosie the Riveter, Norman Rockwell's reference to abstract expressionist painting, to Jackson Pollock, I think is makes The Connoisseur from the early 1960s such a famous work. So Rockwell had this incredibly long career. He saw all of these stylistic revolutions rise up and die down over the course of his career. It only makes sense that he would respond to them or maybe integrate them into his own artwork. But I bet the American middle class never thought that Norman Rockwell would make his very own drip painting like Jackson Pollock. So in order to make the whole experience of looking at a drip painting more palatable to the readers of the Saturday Evening Post, Norman Rockwell adds a museum goer, an art connoisseur in this case, who looks like he's from a different era. He's more traditional, he's wearing the gray suit, his posture is sort of restrained here, but we see him from behind so we can project onto him however we feel about this kind of revolutionary style that we're looking at. Maybe he's intimidated, maybe he's disgusted, maybe he's in awe. We don't really know. what I do love is that we've got this kind of clash of new ideas here. Now, when it comes to Jackson Pollock and abstract expressionism, it was a movement that was really kind of wrapped around this notion of Jackson Pollock, who we see in a photo over here on the left, being sort of like a macho man, a cowboy. They called this action painting. He would put his canvas on the ground, and it was all about his gestures and creating these works. And I think Norman Rockwell is just having a field day, sort of recreating that experience. And he's not trying to be some sort of tough guy. I mean, he's painting here in his socks and his with his pipe still in his mouth. But I love the comparison of these two images. Now, when it comes to the abstract painting that Norman Rockwell created for the Saturday Evening Post, believe it or not, it got rave reviews. Actually, the artist Willem de Kooning said of Norman Rockwell's interpretation of Pollock, he said, in square inch by square inch, it's better than Jackson. So we can think of this not necessarily as a criticism of modern art, but it's Norman Rockwell's sort of nod, his tribute to modern art here. Okay. This next image that I wanted to share with you with an art historical reference in it is one that doesn't create such a splash. It's not quite as obvious at all. This is his painting called Marriage Counselor from 1963. It was intended for the Saturday Evening Post, but it was never published. And perhaps it's because of the reference to domestic violence here. We can see that the man has a black eye. And of course, that's a joke that doesn't age too well, does it? But with this picture, we have Rockwell placing us in the seat of the marriage counselor, looking through our office door to the waiting room, where we see our next clients, this unhappy couple here, the man sitting sort of indignantly with his arms crossed and his chin up, and his wife kind of looking up at him with this interesting mix of emotions. I see a little bit of resentment there. Notice too that her little finger is bandaged as well. Now, just to the right of the couple, we see just a little sliver of a bookshelf, and really the only title that you can make out is Van Eyck. It's in red, and it's this vertical stripe that kind of matches the stripes on either side of the painting. And it's very intentional that Rockwell included that title, because the artist Van Eyck created one of the most famous double portraits in the entire history of art. Traditionally, it's been known as a wedding portrait. So it's a reference to another kind of couple here, a very mysterious couple, might I add. It's only called double portrait now because we don't really know what's happening in the scene. But what we do have is a couple who are, well, he is holding her hand in this really unusual gesture here that doesn't quite connote affection, but it gives us a sense that there is some sort of union that's happening here. Now, I'm not one to look at abstraction and find faces and clouds or that sort of thing, but I do often wonder why Rockwell reserved so much of the space of this picture on the right to the wood grain of this door. And there's a part of me that wonders if these vertical elements with this kind of rounded U shape between them sort of reminded him of the figures from the Van Eyck painting. Now, the other thing that sort of unifies these two works is the fact that in Van Eyck's painting from the 1400s, he references the fact that there are more people in this room beyond just this couple here. There is a mirror on the back wall here, and in the mirror, you can see the reflection of the man and the woman, but then two other people there. Presumably, one of them is the artist creating the picture. And of course, that's what Norman Rockwell is doing with the marriage counselor. It's all about this notion of involving the viewer in this picture. You are the marriage counselor. You're there to kind of figure out what the future will be for this couple that we see through the door there. Now, we'll finish up this section of art historical references with one last fun, quick one. This is Norman Rockwell's take on surrealist painting in the 20th century. This is a really unusual Rockwell. It's called Mr. Apple. His work is over here on the right. This is him tipping his hat to the artist René Magritte, whose famous work, The Son of Man, from 1946, is over here on the left. Now, Magritte was famous for painting the anonymous businessman, the apple, usually bright blue skies with big fluffy clouds. And he would take all of these familiar elements and assemble them in illogical ways. So we don't quite know why there's an apple hovering over the face of this figure over here. So in the 1970s, Norman Rockwell had been in touch with an advertising executive out in California, and it seems as though this might have been a commission. Rockwell wrote to him and said, I've got these shiny apples that I haven't yet eaten. I'll keep them nice and fresh by putting them in the fridge. And then when he sent this advertising executive this picture that he called Mr. Apple, he said, I really enjoyed making this. So it was a chance for him to kind of play. It seems like it was a private commission here, but it's nice to see him try his hand a little bit at surrealism with this kind of fundamentally silly painting here. So almost right on time. We're going to wrap up really quickly here with a short conclusion. We have sort of introduced and established today that Rockwell was really interested in art history, and museums, and that he packaged and represented these subjects to the American people by adding relatable characters and humorous details. He snuck in the art and he made it fun, didn't he? When I came across this painting of this old man up on a flagpole, gilding an eagle with a paintbrush here, he's sort of shining up something artful and making it fun and folksy. And that seemed to embody who Rockwell was and what he was all about. Seemed like the perfect way to finish off today's program. So I thank you for zooming in with us. I'll end there, and I welcome any questions or comments you have about the many works that we saw today. So thank you, everyone. I'll start looking at the Q&A here too.
And Jane, let's give Jane a big virtual round of applause, everyone. And Jane, once you look into the Q&A, just as a reminder for the Q&A and the comments, no one else in the audience can see what's written but you and I. So when you're responding to a question, maybe repeat the question.
Okay, great. The first question in the Q&A, sorry to fly back here. Somebody asked about that early picture of She's My Baby. And the question is from Stephen, what is the geometric touch in She's My Baby? Is it to focus the painting? And I assume, Stephen, that you're asking about the socks and the sweater here. And in terms of focusing, I'm not sure. I'm glad you pointed it out, because I think a lot of these colors kind of complement what she's wearing here. It certainly gives a lot of visual interest to the picture, but I'm not quite sure about the question about focusing. But I think it provides it provides an opportunity for Rockwell to really showcase what he can do. I mean, it's really hard to paint a pattern like that wrapped around somebody's body. So I appreciate you bringing it out. And I'm personally not sure if it has a bigger meaning or purpose within the context of the picture. Stephen also asks, I see a partial arc around the Hayseed Critic piece, so I think it is to center or focus the eye. These arcs too were part of the format for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post, and here we see it again. And so it was a way to kind of spotlight these figures. So it was usually integrated into the masthead. So I'm glad you called that out, Stephen, because I didn't make that clear enough. But those rounded forms that we see in a lot of Rockwell's paintings are related to the actual masthead of the Saturday Evening Post. And of course, it evolved over time too. Kathy says, I think Rockwell and his paintings that make powerful political statements, i.e. the little black girl walking among the suits, or she said, I think of Rockwell making those powerful political statements. Are there enough of these pairings to do a presentation? Kathy, I'm so glad you asked about that, because I actually have another presentation that's just on Rockwell's evolving views of race. So I don't have it currently scheduled, I don't think, but that's one where I would say pay attention to the calendar on my website, and you might be able to catch that one sometime soon. But he, beyond his painting of Ruby Bridges, or inspired by Ruby Bridges, he depicted Black individuals throughout his career, and really kind of had to make a special effort to do that because it was against the policy of the Saturday Evening Post to include people of color unless they were in subservient positions. So there's a whole other hour on that if you're interested. Jeffrey S. Seems like many of the paintings have redheads. Why? Jeffrey, great observation. Rockwell loved a good redhead. He never met a redhead that he didn't want to paint. They're visually interesting. I think as in the real world, you see somebody with red hair and it's very striking. It draws your attention. Diana says, who was the first artist to paint Rosie the Riveter? Was it Rockwell? Good question, Diana. Offhand, I'm not entirely sure. We're all probably familiar with J. Howard Milner's version of Rosie the Riveter, the girl with the headscarf and sort of saying, we can do it. That was also from 1943, but I'm not sure whose came first. So good question. I'll have to look into that. Stephen said, I do see initials JP in the upper portion of the Jackson, or do I see the initials JP in the upper portion of the Jackson Pollock piece? Stephen, you might have just had some sort of incredible breakthrough here. Let's see. We'll have to publish this. Oh, J, like a J and a P. I see it. I think you could be onto something. I never noticed that before. Thanks for finding that, Stephen. Barbara says, Jane's enthusiasm is so contagious. Thank you. Learned so much too. Love making icons so relatable and enjoyable. Really in-depth but humorous look at familiar art. Barbara, thank you so much for coming and for your kind words. Angelina, thank you for your kind words. Teresa asks, how often did companies ask for specific images to be painted? Really good question. That was a big part of his artistic output. I'm not sure how specific his clients were in terms of what to paint other than the product itself. When we think of those varnishing ads, those varnish ads from like the 1920s, I would imagine Rockwell conceived of those images because they're sentimental, they're really human, there's storytelling involved. And I don't know if like an ad executive from a varnish company would have necessarily come up with that. This seems so Rockwell. Great question. Nancy, thank you for your comments. And oh, an anonymous attendee says, is there a Norman Rockwell museum? There is. It's in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. It's definitely worth the trip out west. Susan said, what is your website? My website is iamculturallycurious.com. And we can put that in the chat too. Beatrice says, no question about it. It was an amazing lecture. One of my favorite artists. She said, I did visit his museum in Stockbridge. Amazing. Oh, thank you so much, Beatrice, for your kind words. Kathy, thank you. And let's see, Tanya, I appreciate your kind words as well, and yours, Lisa, and yours, Anne Marie. It looks like a lot of people are going to be going to the Rockwell Museum this summer. Thank you, Marie and Christine, too. Antonio says, can we get another look at the Roadblock painting? Yes, what a composition. Let's see over here. Maybe with those perspectival lines. Yeah, it's a fascinating image. These little slices of life. We've got a window washer over here. I would guess this is the dog's owner, a mailman. Believe it or not, you have the same model for the artist model over here and the girl with the bike. Rockwell was really committed to including people of color in his works, even if you only see them from behind. But he used a Los Angeles neighborhood as inspiration for this work, and there were people of color there, and he thought they deserved to be in the picture. So I love these characters too that look out at you and really involve you in his paintings. Let's see, I'm going to take a quick look at the chat and see if there are any other questions there. I really appreciate all the kind words from everybody. It means a lot to me. Oh, Nancy says, I've been looking at books, I've been to the museum, and you still point out stuff that I haven't seen. Thank you so much, Nancy. I appreciate it. Oh, Judith asks, is the image of the woman in the kiss the same one as in The Daughter of the Artist? That one, I'm not sure, because The Daughter of the Artist is this little girl. Oh, you're thinking of this face here. Oh, that's really funny. It is kind of similar, isn't it? Then we go over here to, where did I put that artist? Oh, he was an everyday artist. The Kiss right here. It's very similar. That is so funny. The blue eyes and the blonde hair. I love that association. All right. I think I got to most of these questions. Oh, Stephen asked a really interesting question. He said, I wonder if the bulldog in Roadblock is sort of symbolic of holding up progress for Black people. Wow. That's a really interesting take on it. I'm not sure Norman Rockwell was there at that point in sort of his own personal understandings, but he definitely got there. That's a really interesting take. Just making sure I haven't missed anything. Thank you, everybody, for these very sweet comments. I appreciate it.
So to Charles' question,
Yep.
Jane, so folks, you will receive an email later today with a link to this recording. And then a few folks asked about your website, which I did just put in the chat.
Thank you. Oh, I just saw one last question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Mary asks a great question of what makes something commercial art versus fine art. And I didn't really explain that. Commercial art is basically art on demand for a customer. Usually for commercial purposes, like illustrating a magazine cover or creating cards or calendars or that sort of thing. Fine art is sort of art that's created by an artist that is driven by their own inspiration, really, not to sell a product or something like that. So, so interestingly, a lot of fine art artists have dabbled in commercial work too. So it's not necessarily one's better or worse, but I think a lot of people have it in their heads that most commercial artists want to become fine art artists because they're familiar with the fact that NC Wyeth, for example, really wanted to make that leap. For Rockwell, he was happy doing what he was doing. All right. Okay, Stephen, I think I got them all.
We're going to give Jane a big virtual round of applause for a wonderful presentation. We are going to see Jane again next, let's see, so basically 4 weeks from today. That's right. So on Friday, August 4th at 10:30. And the name of the presentation is Seaside Escapes. I like this. Very topical. We're going to be looking at seascapes by beloved American artists such as Winslow Homer and Edward Hopper. We're also going to be looking at Newport, Rhode Island, some of those summer homes, and Beauport in Gloucester as well. So very much looking forward to that. Jane, any last words before we wrap it up?
Thank you again, everybody. Enjoy your summers, and we'll see you in a month.
All right. Thanks so much, Jane. Everyone look for that email for me later today. Recording, feedback survey, and more information about our upcoming art history programs and our summer reading program for adults. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.